Hey guys and gals, my name's Enrique. I'm going to be presenting chapter 5 and 6 on the Civil War, A Concise History by Louis Premature. Well, chapter 5 really starts talking about Lincoln's reelection and what they really had to do with it. To be honest, Lincoln wasn't looking so good, especially the Union. During this time, they were losing some battles to the Confederacy, even though the Confederacy was actually running low on morale and supplies. In the beginning, they start talking about religion. Religion, which is a major driving force, of which the South was quoting the Bible into why slavery was legal, in their opinion. In their eyes, why God allows for slavery. And this was a battle of God being by your side in war. And this is how he begins. In December 1863, Salmon Chase suggested adding the phrase "In God We Trust" to American coins, which is what we have now. And with the Coinage Act of 1864, Congress approved the motto. Both sides believed that God supported the cause, and soldiers often expressed a deep religious faith, at least in combat. If everyone needed God's help, wrote a Georgia private, it is in the time of battle. Although the embrace of religion seldom showed in attendance at Sunday service in camp, one soldier observed that still there is a large apt of a certain kind of rude religious feeling. So, this is where religion comes into play. Religion has been into play in many wars and many things. God has always been one of the backings for people to back into when things are going bad, anyway. So we also start talking in this chapter about what Lincoln was able to do, how Lincoln had to, even in the war, had to run for presidency for his reelection, and how he went against one of his former generals. The former general's name is McClellan, if I'm right. Yeah, McClellan. McClellan, who was in the Democrat ticket, he ran against Lincoln. Lincoln had a very bad loss where he ends up losing. My apologies. He loses Cold Harbor, and it says the defeat of Cold Harbor came at a politically precarious time for Lincoln. Any number of rivals, including his own Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, were angling for the Republican presidential nomination in 1864. A bitter John C. Fremont, the Republican candidate in 1856, agreed that having been relieved of his command. He emerged as a candidate of a group of radical Republicans. Other names resurfaced, including Benjamin Butler. Some mentioned Grant as a candidate. In addition to the factionalism between the Republican Party, Lincoln had to worry about the peace Democrats and keeping the support of so-called war Democrats, who favored seeing in the contest through the end. This was no easy task. Democrats in general, whether for continuing to prosecute the war or demanding immediate peace, continued to signify percentage of voters in the North. In the election of 1860, counting only those states that remained in the Union, Lincoln won 47.2% of the votes, and the two Democrat candidates 46.6%. So this war really was not the war. This presidential nomination, this reelection campaign for Lincoln was really important because first, it gave the South an idea of maybe we can wait it out and hope for Lincoln to lose, and we could get a Democrat who's more Southern sympathizing to most likely broker a peace deal, which didn't happen because Lincoln did win. And this would be because of Sherman, who begun his Atlanta campaign, in which he faces off against Joseph E. Johnston and his armies of the Tennessee. And before it was over, 9 separate battles had been fought in addition to countless skirmishes. But at places like New Hope Church and Picket Mills in May, and Keenshaw Mountain in June, Confederate forces repulsed Sherman's army. The frontal assaults that so devastated the Army of the Potomac had the same effect of the military division in the Mississippi. However, despite those successes, Confederate leaders grew unhappy with Johnson, who seemed like McClellan not to want to fight. And this is actually pretty interesting at this point. I don't think he mentioned it in this chapter. But McClellan was always really afraid to go into war because he was afraid that the South would have more soldiers, so he would need more soldiers, and then he would be thinking that there would be more soldiers. And honestly, that's what McClellan couldn't really do. He really couldn't go into battle like grants, you know. So to continue, okay. So for September, which is, as November is always going to be re-election, in my opinion. I think it is November that they always go for a re-election or for a campaign or for presidency. But in September 3rd, in the form of a telegram from Sherman, Atlanta is ours and fairly won. In the campaign that began in May, Sherman's men have fought multiple battles around Atlanta from July onward. The Union commander's strategy was to cut off Hood's supply line. For repeated bombardment of the city, so much of the population of 12,000 had fled. I doubted General Hood would stand the bombardment, wired Sherman on July 21st. But stand if he did. Sherman intensified the efforts, bringing from Chattanooga 8 large siege guns. Sherman intended to make the inside of Atlanta too hot to be endured. Finally, late August, Sherman moved against Hood's railroad supply line. One of his soldiers explained to the general's tendency this way: Sherman don't know the word can't. When Confederate soldiers failed to stop the Union forces at Jonesboro, Hood's had no choice but to evacuate Atlanta. The news that Atlanta had fallen revived Northern morale and Lincoln's chances for re-election. The Chicago Tribune declared, "The dark days are over. We see our way out." The New York Times said that the skies began to brighten. The clouds that lowered over the Union came a month ago, are breaking away. The public temper is buoyant and hopeful. George Templeton Strong, in his diary, infused glorious news this morning. Atlanta taken at last. So this was really a reality for the Confederacy, who they didn't want to see this because this blow and just blow a lot for morale, which is much important in the Union and in the South, because the Southerners thought of this war as the Revolutionary War. They thought themselves the colonies going towards a dictator, and in their opinion, the dictator was Lincoln. And seeing this lost, especially in an important place like Atlanta, one of the first areas to secede, it showed that they weren't gonna hold out much longer. They couldn't maintain this, and they saw the swing of this victory raise the morale of the Northerners who were losing so many battles. And Lincoln, who even before this was thinking, we need a major win so I can get reelected. If not this civil war, this skirmish, this uprising of the Confederates of the Southern states, this was for nothing, because if a northern um, candidate wins, they'll most likely broker peace agreements and allow them to become their own state. And this isn't what Lincoln wanted. So this is what Chapter 5 is about. Chapter 6, one of the last chapters, mentions the end of the war. From Robert E. Lee writing a letter in January 1st, 1865, thinking of slaves, African Americans, to be part of the Confederate Army. And then after this, on his loss to Grant, and this loss basically ended the war. Start talking about, no, so before that, where we start talking about the re-election of Lincoln. Lincoln wins re-election. February 3rd, three Confederate commissioners, Vice President Alexander Stephens, Johnny Campbell, and former Supreme Court Justice R.M.T. Hunter, President of the Confederate Senate, boarded the River Queen at Hampton Roads and met with Lincoln and Seward. Now, this was the first of few peace treaties trying to stop it, trying to stop this war. And Lincoln insisted of the abandonment of slavery as a precondition. However, Davis insisted of the language of peace between two countries. Lincoln did not think of this as a battle between two countries. Beforehand, as I said in Chapter 5, Lincoln saw the South as an uprising, as a rebellion, like the Whiskey Rebellion. And it was his duty to stop it. It was his duty to put it down. And this really wasn't anything. Like, he says it later on in March 4th, a month later. He says Lincoln offers his views of the origins of the war, never referring to the Confederates as anything but insurgents. He acknowledged that both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. He devoted much stuff to God, just like in chapter 5, how God became important. And both sides read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. The prayers of both cannot be answered. That of neither have been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purpose. So this really showed how, at the end of the day, he knew that Americans were fighting Americans. This wasn't a war between two countries. This wasn't a war between European nations, different cultures. The only difference is the economy. Culture-wise, I think we both sides enjoyed working, enjoyed leisure, enjoyed liquor, enjoyed different things. And Lincoln knew that we're all Americans. It's just that we were not united at the time. We weren't the United States. We were always thinking of ourselves as I'm a Virginian, I'm a New Yorker, I'm a New Jerseyan, I'm a North Carolinian, I'm a Virginian. And it was like that throughout, from George Washington's presidency to after Lincoln, to a couple years later. I would say that unity is what made us strong, is what makes us strong in general. And this was probably one of our weakest times. So this chapter continues with Lincoln going to Ford's Theater, and we know what happens in Ford's Theater. He gets assassinated by a former actor, and when he dies, you get you get Andrew Johnson, who becomes a new president. And Andrew Johnson, who was a Southerner, he saw the Southern states with a little bit of hatred, or more hatred, because of the planter aristocrats who were much wealthier, who had a lot of money. And interestingly enough, Johnson was one of the first, the few, my apologies, he was one of the few senators who actually remained in the Union when secession came because he was from the South. And he was a pro-war Democrat, military governor of Tennessee, that allowed him to win part of Lincoln's ticket because Lincoln was a Republican. Lincoln really wasn't a war. He wasn't really pro-war in a way, and he didn't have much military experience. But having someone from the South, from Tennessee, a former governor of Tennessee, as a vice president really looked good for his reelection campaign. So this is what he said. Though the summer, under terms set by Johnson, constitutional conventions met and repudiated secession as well as the Confederate debt, and ratified the 13th Amendment, a condition that remission and ratified on December 6, when Georgia approved it. The 27th out of 36 states to do so, and Johnson took great personal satisfaction from having thousands of members of the Southern elite come groveling for special pardon. Congress should not come into session until December. While some Republicans initially favored Johnson's lenient policies, radical Republicans such as Thaddeus Stevens were outraged by an approach that in the end would actually give the South additional congressional representatives. Stevens sought to enfranchise the blacks, an action opposed not only by Johnson but also by several northern states, including Connecticut, which in the fall defeated the state amendment giving black men the vote. And this talks about Stevens' presidency. Stephen wasn't very radical. He wasn't radical Republican. He wasn't like Lincoln. He didn't see these types of things. It was really him against the Republicans in a way, because he is a Democrat. So that's most likely why. However, what they discovered will lead them to consider civil rights legislation and propose what would become the 14th Amendment. So this becomes a reason why the first Reconstruction wasn't made well. because Lincoln had the idea and Lincoln couldn't put it into place. And the man who took office after him wasn't a true Republican, wasn't one of the men who were fighting to end slavery, because Johnson was a slaveholder. He just didn't own many slaves. But at the end of the day, he was a slave owner, and he did think himself superior as a race. So let me go to the other part where they start talking about the Civil Rights Bill, which he vetoed. It passed by Congress on March 13th. The bill defined persons born in the United States as citizens and granted them full and equal benefits, all laws and proceedings for the security of persons and property. Even the bill supporters recognized how transformative it was. By committing federal authorities to protecting the rights of the citizen, it redefined the role of the government. One senator who supported the measure admitted that this species of legislation is absolutely revolutionary, but are we not in the midst of a revolution? Not only was the bill passed over Johnson's veto, Congress, partly in response to the so-called Black Push just mentioned, went above drafting and debating a new constitutional amendment, the 14th, which would further protect civil rights. Section 1 defined all persons born in the United States as citizens and guaranteed them that no state law shall abridge the privileges of immunities of citizens or deprive any person of life, liberty, and property without the process of law or denying a person equal protection of the law. Section 2 set the terms for the appropriation of representatives, and rather than give blacks the vote, simply reduce Southern representation. My bad. Section 3 prohibited anyone from holding office had previously taken oaths to support the Constitution and then engaged in insurrection or rebellion. Section 4 renounced the Confederate debt and confirmed the validity of federal debt. On June 13, 1866, Congress submitted the amendment to the states. Every Republican in the House voted for it. Every Democrat was opposed. So, if Johnson, during the beginning of Reconstruction, the first Reconstruction, as in my former class with Professor Johnson, we learned about 3 Reconstructions. The first one being this one. I believe the second one being in the Civil Rights Act with President LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, and this Reconstruction, if I remember correctly. But really, Reconstruction, I believe, could have been done faster if Andrew Johnson, wasn't president. Because Andrew Johnson vetoed a lot of things that could have helped African Americans in this age, in that era, in the 1800s, after the Civil War in 1865. After 1865, when he became president, no, my apologies. I made a mistake. Sorry. In 1800s, it would have been faster, and it would have succeeded much better. So to conclude, chapter 5 was about Lincoln, how religion was important to both sides, how both sides used religion in war, use religion to support them, saying that God is with me, God is by my side, God will protect me, we will win this war because God is by our side. And it showed how Lincoln could have lost re-election if it wasn't for 1, maybe 2 victories, major victories, and the raising of his morale. It also showed how he knew that he had to win. He knew that a standstill wouldn't give him victory. He knew that having a state under siege, the Union bombarding the South, wouldn't guarantee him a victory as president. And chapter 6 goes from the surrender of Robert E. Lee, to Washington being assassinated, to Andrew Johnson becoming president, Southern Democrat who had slaves, who, in the palm of his hand, had the ability to allow African Americans to get the right to vote, to get the right to be all in all humans in this country, to be naturalized citizens, and yet he vetoed much things because at the end of the day, he was a slaveholder. He did think his race superior, and it was all in the palm of his hand on the readmittance of the Confederates of the Southern states, whether to punish them or not. And that's what chapter 5 and 6 are about. This has been Enrique talking about Louis P. Missouri's The Civil War, Coincides History. Thanks for listening. It's always a 20-minute video. I don't know how I can make a 5-minute one. These are actually just interesting points. Thanks for listening.